Pay attention to what happens now when someone around you is struggling. They begin describing their situation, a relationship conflict, a personal mistake, a recurring pattern in their life that keeps producing the same painful result. Earlier in your life, moments like this often triggered an immediate response inside you. Your mind began searching for solutions. You offered advice quickly. You analyzed the situation. You suggested strategies they could use to change what was happening. Sometimes you even anticipated their next problem before they mentioned it. You tried to guide them toward a better outcome. This impulse probably felt natural, even generous. Helping others solve their problems often feels like the right thing to do, and in many cases, support is genuinely valuable. But if you look closely at how these interactions used to unfold, you may notice something else that was happening beneath the surface. The moment someone expressed difficulty, part of you felt responsible for easing their struggle. Their discomfort activated something inside you, a subtle pressure to help them improve the situation. You might have felt uneasy watching someone repeat harmful patterns. You might have believed that if they just understood the situation differently, their life would improve, and so you tried to help them see it. Sometimes they appreciated the advice. Other times they resisted it. But either way, you carried part of the emotional weight of their struggle. Carl Jung observed that this dynamic appears frequently in people who are psychologically sensitive and empathetic. Empathy allows you to feel what another person is experiencing. But without clear psychological boundaries, empathy can easily transform into over-responsibility. You begin carrying problems that do not actually belong to you. Earlier in life, the desire to help may have been closely connected to your sense of identity. Being the one who understood, the one who guided, the one who offered solutions. These roles can feel meaningful. They create the sense that your presence improves the lives of others. But Jung warned that the impulse to fix others can sometimes hide unconscious psychological material. When we attempt to solve another person's internal struggles, we may be unconsciously trying to resolve something inside ourselves. For example, if you feel uncomfortable watching someone suffer, the urge to fix their problem may partly reflect your own difficulty tolerating emotional tension. If you believe people should grow quickly, the urge to guide them may reflect your own relationship with personal development. If you feel responsible for other people's well-being, that responsibility may have roots in earlier life experiences. Many people who adopt the role of helper learned early that supporting others created emotional stability in their environment. Perhaps they mediated family conflict. Perhaps they became the listener among friends. Perhaps they discovered that being useful made them feel valued. Over time, helping others can become part of how identity organizes itself. You become the person who offers solutions, the person who gives advice, the person who tries to guide others toward improvement. But as individuation progresses, something inside this pattern begins to shift. You start noticing that not everyone actually wants to change. Some people prefer repeating familiar patterns. Some people ask for advice but resist acting on it. Some people share their struggles simply because they want to be heard, not because they want solutions. At first, these realizations can feel confusing. You may wonder why your efforts to help are not producing the outcomes you expected. You may feel frustrated watching someone repeat the same destructive cycle. But over time, another understanding begins to appear. Growth cannot be imposed. Carl Jung believed that psychological development must be lived from within. No one can integrate another person's unconscious material for them. No one can individuate on someone else's behalf. Each individual must confront their own shadow, their own fears, their own patterns. And that confrontation cannot be forced by outside guidance. Earlier, you might have believed that if someone simply understood their situation more clearly, they would naturally change. Now you recognize something more complex. Insight alone rarely transforms behavior. Transformation requires willingness, timing, personal readiness, and often a period of struggle that cannot be avoided. This realization changes how you respond when someone describes their problems. You still listen. You still care. But the impulse to immediately intervene begins to soften. Instead of rushing to provide solutions, you allow the conversation to unfold. You ask questions. You observe how the person interprets their own situation. You notice whether they are genuinely searching for change or simply expressing frustration. And slowly, you release the pressure to fix what they are experiencing. Carl Jung once wrote that knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of others. This insight reflects a fundamental psychological truth. The more deeply you understand your own inner world, the less compelled you feel to control someone else's. You recognize that every person must encounter their own psychological material, their fears, their blind spots, their unresolved emotions. Those encounters are not mistakes. They are part of development. Earlier, you may have believed that helping someone avoid suffering was an act of care. Now you begin to see that some struggles cannot be avoided, and try and prevent them can actually interfere with growth. For example, imagine someone repeatedly choosing relationships that create emotional turmoil. Earlier, you might have tried to explain the pattern. You might have pointed out the warning signs. You might have encouraged them to make different choices. But now, you recognize that understanding the pattern intellectually does not always produce change. The person must eventually experience the consequences of their own decisions, not as punishment, but as information. Carl Jung believed that psychological awareness often emerges through direct experience rather than explanation. People rarely transform because someone else instructs them to. They transform when their own experiences become impossible to ignore. When this understanding becomes clear to you, your role in other people's struggles naturally changes. You stop assuming responsibility for their outcomes. You stop believing that your insight must guide their decisions. You stop trying to manage the psychological development of the people around you. This does not mean you withdraw compassion. You still listen carefully. You still offer support when it is genuinely welcomed. But you recognize that the path of another person's growth belongs to them, not to you. And this realization creates a new kind of emotional freedom. You no longer carry the weight of fixing everyone. You allow people to walk their own path, even when that path includes mistakes. Even when that path includes struggle, because you understand something now that once felt difficult to accept. Every person must meet their own life directly, and no amount of advice can replace that encounter. Your role is not to redesign someone else's journey. Your role is simply to meet them honestly where they are, without trying to carry what was never yours to carry. And when that shift takes place, the entire structure of your relationships begins to change. You remain compassionate, but you are no longer responsible. You remain supportive, but you are no longer controlling. And that quiet change marks the beginning of a more mature way of relating to the people in your life, one where empathy remains present, but the burden of fixing others finally falls away. Notice how different your reactions are now when someone continues repeating the same mistake. They describe the same relationship problem again, the same frustration at work, the same cycle that seems to lead them back to the same result. Earlier, situations like this might have activated a kind of urgency in you. You listened carefully, but your mind was already assembling the solution. You pointed out the pattern. You suggested what they should do differently. You try to help them avoid the next version of the same problem. Sometimes you explain it clearly. Sometimes you explain it more than once, because you genuinely believe that if the person could just see the situation the way you saw it, they would finally make a better choice. But over time, you began noticing something that slowly changed your behavior. Insight does not always produce change. People can recognize a pattern and still repeat it. They can understand the consequences and still move toward the same outcome. At first, this realization can feel frustrating, because when you care about someone, watching them repeat painful situations is difficult. Your instinct is to prevent the pain, to guide them towards something healthier. But psychological growth eventually reveals something deeper. Not every struggle is meant to be prevented. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological development requires encountering one's own unconscious material directly. Advice may illuminate the path, but it cannot replace the experience that forces someone to confront their patterns. A person who repeatedly chooses the same type of destructive relationship may intellectually understand the problem, but until they fully feel the emotional consequences of that pattern, real change rarely happens. A person who constantly avoids responsibility may hear the advice to take accountability, But until the avoidance produces undeniable consequences, the behavior often continues. Earlier in life, you may have believed that your role in these situations was to accelerate someone's growth. If you could just explain things clearly enough, if you could show them the pattern, if you could help them avoid the mistake, then their life would improve. But individuation slowly changes that belief. You begin realizing that trying to accelerate another person's development can quietly become a form of control, not intentional control, but psychological interference. Carl Jung believed that every individual must confront their own shadow, the unconscious aspects of themselves that shape their behavior. No one else can perform this confrontation on their behalf. When you try to fix someone's pattern for them, you may unintentionally interrupt the process that would eventually lead them to self-awareness. Because self-awareness rarely arrives through explanation alone. It arrives through experience, through consequences, through the moments when a person finally recognizes the cost of their own patterns. Earlier, you may have felt responsible for helping people avoid those moments. Now you begin to see them differently. Those moments are often necessary. They are the psychological pressure that makes transformation possible. This does not mean you become indifferent to someone's pain. Empathy remains present. You still care when someone suffers, but you recognize that their suffering is not something you can solve from the outside. You can offer perspective. You can share insight if they genuinely ask for it, but you cannot carry the responsibility for their decisions. This realization begins changing the way you respond in conversations. Someone may explain a recurring problem. Instead of immediately offering solutions, you allow them to speak. You listen. You reflect back what you hear, but you resist the urge to take ownership of the situation. You allow them to remain responsible for their own choices. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you spent years being the person others relied on for guidance. The listener, the advisor, the problem solver. When you stop playing that role automatically, people sometimes notice a difference. They may ask why you seem quieter, why you no longer jump in with solutions. But internally, something important has changed. You are no longer trying to manage the outcome of someone else's life. Carl Jung believed that individuation requires reclaiming psychological energy that was previously invested in external structures. Over-responsibility for other people's growth is one of those structures. When you release it, your energy returns to your own development. You become more attentive to your own patterns, your own reactions, your own internal process. Instead of constantly analyzing how others should change, your awareness turns inward. This inward shift often brings a surprising form of calm. You stop feeling responsible for correcting every situation around you. You stop carrying the emotional burden of other people's choices. You allow life to unfold according to the decisions each person makes. And when someone asks for your perspective sincerely, you can still share it. But you no longer feel compelled to ensure they follow it, because you understand something that once felt difficult to accept. No one changes because they are told to. They change when their own experience becomes clear enough that transformation becomes unavoidable. Carl Jung often describes psychological growth as a process that cannot be forced. It unfolds through the tension between conscious awareness and unconscious behavior. That tension belongs to each individual. And when you stop trying to resolve that tension for others, your relationships begin to feel different. You become less reactive to other people's struggles, less entangled in their decisions. You remain supportive without becoming responsible. You remain compassionate without becoming controlling. And in that space, something important happens. The people around you begin encountering their own lives more directly, without someone constantly stepping in to fix the situation, without someone absorbing the consequences for them. Sometimes they grow. Sometimes they continue repeating the same patterns. But either way, you understand that their journey belongs to them, not to you. And releasing that responsibility allows you to relate to others with a new kind of clarity, one where care remains present, but the compulsion to rescue finally fades. Observe what happens now when someone you care about continues walking into the same difficulty. You see the pattern clearly. The same kind of relationship that ends in the same way. The same professional decisions that recreate the same frustration. The same emotional reactions that keep producing the same conflict. Earlier in life, Watching this unfold could create a strong internal reaction. You felt compelled to intervene, to explain what the person could not see, to offer advice that might help them avoid repeating the cycle. It often came from genuine concern. When you care about someone, it is painful to watch them suffer through problems that appear preventable. But something in your response has changed. You still notice the pattern. You still understand what is happening. But the impulse to correct the situation is no longer as strong. You no longer feel responsible for guiding someone out of every difficulty they encounter. Instead, you allow a different kind of space to exist in interaction. You listen. You remain present. But you do not assume ownership of the outcome. Carl Jung believed that psychological growth cannot occur through external instruction alone. Each person must eventually confront the consequences of their own behavior and the unconscious forces driving it. This confrontation is rarely comfortable. It often involves disappointment, conflict, loss. But those experiences create the tension necessary for awareness. Without that tension, many unconscious patterns remain invisible. Earlier, you may have tried to reduce that tension for people around you. You wanted to spare them from unnecessary pain. You wanted to help them move more quickly toward clarity. But over time, you began recognizing a difficult truth. Intervening too early can delay the moment when someone truly sees their own pattern. When another person consistently softens the consequences of your decisions, the motivation to change becomes weaker. Carl Jung described the individuation process as a confrontation with the unconscious. This confrontation cannot be completed through explanation from another person. It must be experienced directly. The person must see the pattern in their own life, feel the consequences of their choices, recognize the gap between who they are and who they could become. That recognition rarely arrives through advice. It arrives through lived experience. As this understanding deepens, the way you relate to other people's struggles begins to transform. You stop trying to carry the psychological work that belongs to them. You stop believing that insight alone can transform someone's behavior. You begin respecting the autonomy of their path. This respect may look like distance from the outside. Someone may expect you to offer solutions, to tell them what they should do, but instead, you remain calm. You listen without taking control of the situation. You trust that the person will eventually encounter the clarity they need, even if that clarity arrives through difficulty. Carl Jung believed that real compassion involves recognizing the limits of our influence over another person's inner life. You can support someone. You can care about their well-being, but you cannot live their psychological journey for them. Trying to do so often creates subtle forms of control. You begin managing their choices, their reactions, their development, and in doing so, you unintentionally interfere with the natural process through which self-awareness emerges. Letting go of the rescuer role, therefore, becomes an act of respect. Respect for the individual's capacity to confront their own life. Respect for the pace at which psychological growth unfolds. Respect for the fact that some lessons cannot be explained. They must be experienced. This shift changes the emotional dynamic in many of your relationships. You may notice that conversations feel lighter. You no longer leave interactions carrying someone else's unresolved problems. You no longer feel responsible for fixing situations that were never yours to solve. Your empathy remains, but the weight of responsibility disappears. Carl Jung once wrote that knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. When you understand your own patterns, you recognize that growth came from moments when you face them yourself. No one could remove that work for you. No one could perform your transformation on your behalf. The same principle applies to everyone else. They must encounter their own patterns, their own fears, their own blind spots. And when they do, real change becomes possible. You can stand beside someone during that process, but you cannot walk the path for them. This realization creates a different kind of relationship with the people around you. You stop positioning yourself as a guide of their life. You become a witness instead, present, supportive, but not controlling. If someone sincerely asks for your perspective, you can offer it, but you no longer feel the need to ensure they follow your advice. Their choices belong to them, and their development unfolds according to their own readiness. Carl Jung believed that individuation ultimately leads to psychological sovereignty. Each person becomes responsible for their own inner world, their own decisions, their own transformation. When you accept this principle, something inside you relaxes. You are no longer trying to correct every pattern you observe. You are no longer managing the growth of the people around you. You allow them the dignity of confronting their own life, even when that confrontation is difficult, because you now understand that the role you once tried to play, the fixer, the rescuer, the guide of everyone else's growth, was never truly yours to carry. And releasing that role creates space for a more balanced kind of connection, one where empathy remains, but responsibility returns to the place where it belongs. With each individual and the path they must ultimately walk themselves. Eventually, a quiet realization begins settling into your relationships. You still care about people. You still listen when someone shares their struggles. You still feel empathy when someone you value is facing difficulty. But something fundamental has changed. You no longer feel responsible for solving their life. Earlier, helping others may have felt like an obligation. When someone described a problem, you immediately began searching for solutions. You analyzed their choices. You explained what they could do differently. You tried to guide them toward a better outcome. And if they continued repeating the same patterns, you felt frustrated because you believed the solution was visible. But Carl Jung understood something essential about psychological development. Transformation cannot be imposed from the outside. It must arise from within the individual. Advice can illuminate a possibility, but it cannot replace the experience that makes someone ready to change. And as you begin recognizing this truth, the role you play in other people's lives naturally evolves. You still support people, but you no longer assume responsibility for their growth. You can offer perspective when someone sincerely seeks it, but you do not feel compelled to manage the outcome of their choices. This shift does not mean your empathy has disappeared. In fact, it often becomes more genuine, because your care is no longer mixed with control. You are not trying to redesign someone else's path. You are simply present with them as they walk it. Carl Jung once wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." When you understand your own psychological journey, you recognize that your most important insights came through lived experience, through mistakes, through consequences, through moments when reality forced you to confront something within yourself. No one can remove that process for you. And in the same way, no one can remove it for someone else. This realization brings a surprising kind of peace. You stop carrying emotional burdens that were never yours to carry. You stop feeling responsible for guiding every person toward awareness. You stop measuring your value by how much you can improve someone else's life. Instead, you allow each person the dignity of facing their own path. And when they are ready for change, they will recognize it themselves. Before we close, consider something honestly. When someone around you is struggling today, what do you feel? Do you still feel responsible for fixing the situation? Or have you begun allowing people to walk their own journey, even when it includes mistakes? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might help someone else realize that releasing the role of rescuer is not indifference. It is respect. And if this reflection resonated with something you've been noticing in your own relationships, share this video with someone who might also be learning that compassion does not require carrying everyone. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can offer another person is space to become who they are meant to become, on their own path, in their own time.